Parvathy Prem. Parvathy, are you there?
I am.
Fantastic. We see you,
Okay, let me share my screen.
and we'll see soon. Your talk is Lunar Volatile Science at the Lander Scale, and there we go.
All right, and Carl, you can see the slides okay?
Yes, great.
All right, well, thanks, Carl, and hello, everyone. Before I get into things, I'm Parvathy. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this, Dana Hurley at APL, Mehdi Bena at NASA Goddard, Tom Orlando at Georgia Tech. This is work that was supported by Survey, and the computational resources that I used for some of the simulations that I'll show came from the Texas Advanced Computing Center, to which I had access through a grant from the NSF Exceed program. So this is a talk about lunar volatile science at the lander scale. And our story begins before the lander even reaches the surface. It's been recognized for several decades that almost any landed lunar mission will be an active volatile release experiment, because when a spacecraft descends towards the lunar surface, it fires its engines to slow down. That releases exhaust gases, including a variety of interesting species. And that presents us with both a scientific opportunity to study how those volatiles interact with the lunar environment, but there's also an operational need when it comes to planning missions, figuring out where and when and how to take measurements of surface or exospheric volatiles, or even collecting samples. There's a real need to understand where exhaust gases go and how long they remain in the lunar environment. The motivation to revisit this problem comes from the fact that within the next couple of years, we are very likely to have a number of volatile detectors at the lunar surface again. This is something that's been done before. During the Apollo 17 mission, the LACE instrument operated for 10 lunar days, primarily during the lunar night, and acquired data that still underpin much of our understanding of the lunar exosphere. But when it comes to translating these observations into science, modeling of some kind is usually a critical part of that process. And so to model a spacecraft-generated exosphere, we start with the spacecraft. We make some assumptions for the density, velocity, and temperature of the gas coming out of that spacecraft nozzle. And we use those conditions to create representative molecules that expand away from the spacecraft as it moves towards the lunar surface. And I should note that in the simulations that I'll show in these slides today, I'm focusing on the water vapor component of the exhaust, which is about a third of the mass released, though it depends on what kind of fuel you're burning. Once we create these representative molecules, we allow them to move away from the spacecraft and to interact with the lunar environment. In the vicinity of the spacecraft, the gas is sufficiently dense that molecules can exchange energy and momentum through collisions. Further away, molecules largely follow ballistic trajectories, which are punctuated by these occasional collisions with the lunar surface. When a molecule collides with the surface, we assume that it absorbs for some length of time that depends on the local surface temperature. Molecules can also escape. They can be broken apart by sunlight. And of course, they can also potentially migrate to permanently shadowed regions near the lunar poles. And so if we put all of that together, we can begin to simulate what happens to those exospheric gases. The two snapshots here are taken at 3 hours after a nominal landing scenario. In purple, you're looking down at the lunar night side, where water molecules that were released during the descent burn have temporarily absorbed. Purple indicates the coverage density. And then these halos that you see around the moon show the gas density, so the exospheric density of water molecules in a 500 kilometer high slice through the plane of spacecraft descent. So this is 3 hours after landing, and you can see at this point, the water vapor that was released is already well on its way to being globally dispersed. In the vicinity of the spacecraft, this was for a landing at 70 degrees south of a Chang'e 3 class spacecraft. In the the vicinity of the landing site, the local exospheric density increases briefly by several orders of magnitude before that global dispersal happens. And what's interesting is that you'll notice that these two cases, where we assume two different values for binding energy of water molecules to the surface, are very different. And that indicates that if we measure this during future landings, that what we measure could be diagnostic of what the binding energy is. And that remains something that we don't have definitive answers for. It's also important to note that the Exos mass, and as a result, these densities that you see here, scale with lander mass. This was a fairly small, though impressive, lander. If you have something that's heavier, it's going to burn more fuel. These densities will scale. The next few slides just step through 6 hours after landing, 24 hours after landing. You can see that dispersal continuing. We can also look at what happens in the long term. This rather busy figure here shows the fate of exhaust water vapor over the course of 2 lunar days. So if we walk through this line by line, you'll notice that after 2 lunar days, if we look at these red lines that I'm pointing to, between 10 to 30% of the water vapor that was released is still in the lunar environment. 2 days, 2 lunar days, that is 2 months later. Most of this is absorbed to the night side surface, which acts as this safe harbor for migrating volatiles. A small amount is also aloft and migrating to the poles or on its way before it's photo-destroyed. We begin these simulations at a point, we could begin earlier, but we begin for this particular case at a point in time when the exhaust is mostly pointing down towards the lunar surface. And so escape is not as significant a loss process as photolysis. You'll also notice that around 13% of the water vapor that's released reaches cold traps, not just at the South Pole for a landing at 70 degrees south, but also the North Pole. And if we project those loss rates, those trapping rates rather, forward, we can anticipate that eventually, for this landing scenario, around 20% of the water vapor released would be deposited at both the South and North Polar cold traps. And of course, something that's a little implicit in this is that when you have landings at higher latitudes, there aren't really many substantial cold traps at 70 degrees south, but at even higher latitudes, you do have the possibility of delivering more water directly to polar cold traps. And so I want to go now from this global scale to the lander scale. So this is very much work in progress, but I think we still have some things to talk about. So what I've done here is to take that nominal descent trajectory that I modeled earlier and to move it to a landing site that's around 10 kilometers from the rim of Shackleton Crater. This is a snapshot of the density of water absorbed to the surface 10 seconds into the landing burn. So the spacecraft started firing its thrusters here, it's now here, it still has a long way to go, but it's released water vapor that's fallen back and absorbed to the cold polar surface. I included this next slide here because I think it illustrates the scale. Thanks, Carl. I think it illustrates the scale of the problem. This is, in this view, you're looking down at that same figure you saw on the previous page, my attempt at an artistic impression of this. But what you'll notice is that in this case, because the surface is so cold and because we've assumed a relatively high activation energy, the contamination of the surrounding surface is relatively localized. But at the same time, this gives you an idea of the scale. This is 10 seconds into the descent burn. And at this point, water vapor from the spacecraft is spread across the surface of Shackleton. And I'm not showing the cold trap molecules here, but you do get an idea of how this material spreads. In this case, you have a fairly thin layer of water absorbed to the floor of Shackleton. And of course, the exosphere here is responding, volatiles are responding to temperature. And another interesting aspect of this is that temperature itself is more complex near the poles. I put this table in for reference. I don't expect you to read it, but the main point is that the lunar volatile system has several constituent species, many of which can also be released by spacecraft. Depending on what kind of fuel you burn, you can have a mixture of species. Water actually may be the least volatile of some of these species that have released. Some of the more volatile species like H2 or CO are likely to disperse fairly rapidly, but they also happen to have fairly long lifetimes against photolysis, and they may persist for longer. Others, such as CO2, N2, and NH3, are somewhere in between. They have a range of residence times and a range of photo lifetimes. And so I do want to try and leave time for questions. So I'm going to leave the summary slide up and let you all read it. But the main message is that, well, one message is that there is still a lot of interesting work to be done from the modeling perspective. And I hope to update you on this as we progress through this. But also measurements of the surface and exosphere during and after future landings are really critical. And I hope that's something that we do going forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Parvathy. Excellent talk. There are a couple questions online. And first one from Phil Metzger is, what type of model determined the original distribution of volatiles from the descent thrusters?
All right, so for the density, temperature, and velocity of the gas immediately outside the nozzle, we use an analytical expression that was derived by Roberts in 1966. Once these representative molecules are initialized, though, I then use a direct simulation Monte Carlo code to look at how the gas expands. So that's a DSMC code. And we do have a paper that is under review at JGR, which goes into that in much more detail. And I'm always happy to follow up with excruciating detail by email.
Okay. May have answered his second part of the question. I didn't understand it if you did, though, which is, did it model the shockwave and ground jet features of the plume, or was it a simple conical assumption or something else?
Right. That's a great question, Phil. So because we're modeling, because these simulations start at a fairly high altitude, the spacecraft isn't quite close enough to the surface yet that you have a strong shock forming. And in fact, we cut off our simulations when the spacecraft is around 40 meters from the surface. So this is before the stage at which you have those strong shock features forming and surface alterations happening. So the model could be used to look at those near field effects in more detail, but in this case, we're sort of focusing on what happens earlier on in the descent when the gas has the potential to expand a larger region.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And there are several more questions on chat. So if you would jump on there and answer them if you have time. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Carl.